Greetings, travelers. I'm your host, the C. that knows a lot, Dr. Waluigi. As someone who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think it's safe to say that those of us born around that time grew up with a lot of weird movies. If you look up even just a small bit of the movies that were targeted to kids in the 90s, you could tell that these movies were mostly made with gimmicks to sell toys, or were made with the intent to scare the ever-loving shit out of you. Good times. But the one movie that has stuck with me through all these years has to be the one that starred Doc Brown and Kevin McAllister, who tried to get kids to read. Yes, really. This is my review of The Pagemaster.
Whatever you imagine.
The movie was directed by Joe Johnston and Piote Hunt, and was written by David Cassie, David Kirshner, and Ernie Contreras. As I said before, the movie was made initially to get kids to read more books, as at the time, some parent groups were concerned that kids weren't reading enough. Keep in mind that in the 80s and 90s, a lot of parent groups had a lot of control over what went into kids' media, as many studios were afraid to be sued by said parents. But that's neither here nor there. The movie took a long time to make, 3 years in fact, for two big reasons. One is that this was one of the few live-action animated movies that use CG, which, for those of you that don't know, was still a relatively new type of technology to work with at the time, which partially led to the film going over budget as the people working on the movie didn't know how to use CG and had to be trained on this new type of animation. So, when you have to train animators who have only worked with traditional hand-drawn animation, it tends to take a while for them to learn how to use something complicated like CG. The other reason is because of the stupid lawsuit. Yep, this movie went through a bunch of legal action from its own producer and writer. From what I read, David Kirshner took legal action against David Cassie just so he could be the only one to get the writing credit. Suffice to say, he lost with the help of the WGA, or Writers Guild of America, and everyone got the credit they deserved as well as getting paid. Which is sad considering all of the recent bullshit that has occurred with the writer's strike. Sadly though, the movie was still a box office bomb, making only $13.7 million against a $34 million budget. Critics were not impressed with the movie, saying that the movie was very long and that the message to get kids to read wasn't that strong. And while the movie hasn't got that much of a cult following, it does have its fans. Which I am one of, as I think that... Well, let's get into the movie's plot first.
Whatever you imagine.
The movie follows Richard Tyler, played by Macaulay Culkin, who's a coward and often runs away to his medical books where he constantly pulls out statistics of how everything tries to kill you. However, when his dad sends him on an errand, he gets lost in a storm, leading him into a random library. There, after he tries to find a phone to call his parents, he gets sent to an illustrated version of the library in which he must journey through 3 sections of the library in order to find the exit to the library with the help of his new friends. Can Richard find his way through the animated world of stories? And what lessons are in store for him by the mysterious caretaker and overseer of the library simply known as the Pagemaster?
Whatever you imagine.
This is probably one of the few movies from my childhood that I remember because of the well-known actors from this movie. With talented actors like Patrick Stewart, Whoopi Goldberg, Frank Welker, and Christopher Lloyd, it's easy to see why I remember so many movies from my childhood, as these actors were in just about everything, and it elevates this movie from being completely forgotten. Though the one actor that I want to praise and talk about in this segment is Macaulay Culkin. This was his first voice acting role, and it's surprisingly good for a first attempt. Most actors that try out voice acting for the first time don't have a grasp on the idea of having to act with just their voice, which can unfortunately lead to some pretty bad or weak performances in the movies they appear in. But Macaulay does a very good job during the animation portion of the movie. I do find it weird that he got nominated for a Razzie for this movie. Like, I agree with the choices for Getting Even with Dad and Richie Rich, but really? This was worthy of being nominated as one of the movies with the worst acting? I guess some people just really didn't like Macaulay Culkin at the time.
Whatever you imagine.
I don't think I need to mention just how amazing the animation is in this movie. The movie's animation was done by some of the same team that worked on An American Tail and The Land Before Time, and it's still amazing to look at. I love that the backgrounds feel like they are paintings that have come to life with interesting stories behind them, and that some of the areas are also made out of books. Even the CG in this movie is really good and adds to the movie's charm. The character designs in this are pretty good with the characters they were able to get from some of the stories that were in the public domain. Though I do think that the main cast is where the designs stand out, especially the books and the Pagemaster himself. His clothes and beard look like folded up pieces of paper, and his staff is just a giant scroll. It's a very fun and unique design. The books I do like as well, as they each represent a different type of genre. From a pirate, a fairy, and a hunchback, the books have their own personal charm that hold up, even if they have some annoying moments. The music is also amazing, which isn't surprising since it was done by the great James Horner, who also did the music for An American Tail and The Land Before Time. Wow, I'm surprised that the animation portion of this movie wasn't directed by Don Bluth himself. This is also another movie that has a great pop song that I like to listen to on repeat. Seriously, I love 90s movie pop songs. They are the best, and no one can change my mind. But while the animation segments are beautiful to look at, there are some improvements that needed to be made.
Whatever you imagine.
For me, this movie has two big flaws in it that keep it from reaching that classic movie status. The first is the pacing. The movie seems to drag on in the middle, where the characters seem to just do things. Not interesting or fun things, instead they just drag their butts along and meander until they decide to get up and continue their adventure. It's not too bad as it only happens once or twice, but it does feel like somebody just gave up halfway through writing this story and just said, whatever, animators will figure something out. The other big issue is that there isn't enough representation of the other genres. So in order for Richard to get to the exit of the library world, he has to travel through 3 different sections, the horror, adventure, and fantasy sections, and to represent these different stories, Richard and the books travel through different stories of each section. The horror section is represented by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and a short reference to generic ghost stories. The adventure section is represented by Moby Dick, Treasure Island, and a short reference to Gulliver's Travels, and fantasy is represented by a dragon with references to Mother Goose, Humpty Dumpty, Alice in Wonderland, and Jack and the Beanstalk. Do you see the problem here? Horror and fantasy have very little representation in the movie, to the point that the fantasy section is just different references to fairy tales, and the finale being the equivalent to a final boss in a video game, which this movie did get on all platforms, though I haven't been able to play the one on the Genesis yet. It sucks that we couldn't get the same amount of acknowledgement in the other genres, especially when you see the deleted and extended scenes where they were going to add Frankenstein and have more extended fantasy scenes. So, because the movie was cut for time, it does leave it a little empty in the middle. If I could make a suggestion on how they could improve this movie with a remake, make it a TV show. Yeah, make it a show that focuses on different kids going on their own adventures through the library with different genres that focus on their own personal issues like Richard. Hell, you could have Macaulay return as the librarian / Pagemaster, as Christopher Lloyd, I feel, is too old to act anymore. It honestly would be interesting to see this premise taken further by expanding it as a TV show. Though with this being a movie owned by Fox, and Disney currently owns Fox, maybe don't get them to make a series like this.
Whatever you imagine.
Despite this movie's poor middle and weak representation of the other genres, I do think it has some pretty good ideas, amazing animation, and an amazing cast that I think holds the movie up. I will admit that this movie didn't make me want to read more as a kid, but I think that has more to do with the fact that I was more of a movie / video game kid than I was a book kid. But I still came back to watch the movie for how fun the ideas were and the amazing animation. Overall, I give The Pagemaster a 7 out of 10. If you're looking for a live-action animated movie that has some creative ideas with a fun cast, this is definitely worth your time. Thanks for watching, I'm Dr. Waluigi, and remember, don't judge a book by its cover, cause you'll never know what's inside. Good night, everyone.
Whatever you imagine. Can one